Night Watch. The mall was a skeleton at night, stripped of its daytime glamour, its endless corridors stretching like arteries through the dark. Fluorescent lights flickered sporadically, casting ghostly reflections on the polished tiles. Alex never minded the solitude, it was better than dealing with people. His job as the night security guard was simple: monitor the cameras, walk the rounds, and make sure no one broke in. But something felt off tonight, like the building itself was holding its breath. The security office was a cramped room with walls plastered in screens showing different parts of the mall. Alex leaned back in his chair, sipping lukewarm coffee, eyes half-lidded as the monotony lulled him. Then, movement on screen 4 snapped him upright. A faint, flickering shadow slithered across the empty hallway near the old service elevator. He squinted, rewinding the footage. Nothing. Just empty tiles stretching into the darkness. But he knew what he saw. Grabbing his flashlight, Alex stepped into the silent corridors. The mall's vast emptiness swallowed the sound of his footsteps. Mannequins stood like frozen sentinels in store windows, their glassy eyes reflecting the beam of his light. As he approached the elevator, he noticed something strange: a door slightly ajar to the left, a door he was certain hadn't been there before. It was old, the paint chipped, and a faint, cold draft seeped through the crack. He hesitated. This door wasn't on any floor plan he'd ever seen. Heart pounding, he pushed it open. A narrow staircase spiraled down, swallowed by darkness. Against better judgment, Alex descended, each step groaning under his weight. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of damp concrete and something metallic, like rust or blood. At the bottom, the flashlight flickered. He tapped it, cursing under his breath. The beam steadied, illuminating a long, narrow corridor that stretched beyond the reach of light. The walls were raw concrete, streaked with dark stains that looked too organic to be just water damage. As he walked, the sense of being watched gnawed at his nerves. Halfway down the corridor, Alex noticed scratch marks on the floor, as if something heavy had been dragged. His breath quickened. The faint sound of movement echoed ahead, a soft shuffling, like bare feet on concrete. He froze, straining his ears. Silence. Then, a whisper, faint but clear, "Turn back." Alex spun around. No one there. He forced himself forward, each step heavier than the last. At the end of the corridor, another door, this one rusted, dented, with no handle, just a dark gap where it should have been. He pushed it open, the metal groaning in protest. Beyond was a room lit by a single, flickering bulb. The walls were covered in old, torn posters, the kind you'd expect in an abandoned subway station. But it wasn't the walls that caught his attention, it was the figure standing in the corner. Tall, too thin, its face obscured by the shadows. It didn't move. It just stood there. Alex's heart thundered in his chest. "Hey!" His voice echoed, thin and hollow. No response. He raised the flashlight. The figure vanished. A rush of cold air blew past him, snuffing out the weak bulb. Darkness swallowed him whole. Panic surged. He stumbled back, fumbling for the door, but his hand met only rough concrete. The door was gone. His flashlight flickered again, then died. Alex stood in the suffocating dark, his own breath ragged and loud. Then, just behind him, a whisper, colder than the air itself, "You shouldn't be here." Like they'd been there for decades, though the mall itself was barely 10 years old. The stains trailed along the walls in erratic patterns, some dripping down like old tears. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing against his chest as if the darkness itself had weight. His footsteps echoed unnervingly, but there was something else, a faint shuffling sound, just beyond the edge of the light. Not rhythmic, not mechanical. Organic. Alex's grip on the flashlight tightened, his thumb brushing over the radio clip to his belt. He considered calling it in, but what would he even say? "Hey, there's a door that doesn't exist and noises in a hallway that shouldn't be here?" He knew how that would sound. His curiosity edged out his fear. As he moved deeper, the shuffling stopped, Silence crept back, thick and suffocating. The corridor ended in another door, this one metallic and rusted, with no handle, just a thin, horizontal slit near the top. He leaned in, peering through it, but saw only darkness. Then something moved, a fleeting flicker, like a shadow shifting inside a shadow. His breath caught. Suddenly, the door creaked open a fraction on its own. Alex staggered back, heart racing. The flashlight flickered again, then died completely, plunging him into absolute darkness. His fingers fumbled to turn it back on, and when the beam sputtered back to life, the door was wide open. Beyond it, there was no room, no walls, just an abyss, a void that seemed to pulse like a living thing. And then he saw them. Shapes emerging from the darkness, not walking but gliding, their outlines distorted as if reality itself was rejecting them. No faces, no features, just silhouettes shifting unnaturally. They stopped at the threshold, as if bound by some invisible barrier. But Alex could feel their attention, heavy and tangible, pressing against his mind like icy fingers. Panic surged. He turned and ran, the flashlight swinging wildly, casting frantic streaks of light that seemed to twist the shadows into grotesque forms. The corridor felt longer now, impossibly long. The walls seemed to close in, the stains on them writhing, moving like veins pulsing with dark blood. His breath came in ragged gasps, footsteps pounding in a rhythm that didn't match his own, a second set of steps, faster, closing in. He burst into the stairwell, slamming the door shut behind him. Silence. Just his own gasping breath and the thundering of his heart. He didn't wait to process it, he sprinted up the stairs, back to the familiar fluorescent flicker of the mall. But something was wrong. The lights were dimmer than before, casting longer, darker shadows. The mall was different, wrong. Storefronts were unfamiliar, names in languages he didn't recognize. Mannequins in the windows had changed too. Their faces were sharper, more human, their glass eyes following him as he staggered past. Alex stumbled into the security office, slamming the door and locking it behind him. He collapsed into the chair, trying to catch his breath. The monitors flickered, static buzzing softly. Then, one by one, the screens cleared, not showing the mall, but that endless dark corridor, the door still ajar, and something slowly emerging from it. His radio crackled, a faint whisper bleeding through the static. His name. Over and over, distorted, layered with other voices that didn't belong. He reached to turn it off, but his hand froze. On the monitor, one of the dark shapes turned its faceless head, staring directly at him. Alex never left the office. When the day shift arrived, the room was empty, the monitors dark. No trace of him, except for the security footage left running, hours of empty corridors, flickering lights, and that door. Always slightly open. Grotesque shapes, writhing and stretching along the walls like they wanted to reach out and pull him back. His boots pounded against the stained concrete floor, echoing louder than seemed natural, merging with a low, humming noise that grew steadily behind him, a sound that wasn't mechanical, but alive, like 1,000 whispered voices tangled together. Alex's breath came in ragged gasps, his chest burning as he sprinted back the way he came. But the corridor felt longer now, impossibly so, like the mall itself had shifted while he wasn't looking. He glanced back just once, a mistake burned into his mind, the shapes were following, not running, not even moving faster, just existing closer. Every time his eyes flicked away and back, they'd gained more ground without a single step. He burst through the strange door, slamming it shut with all his strength. There was no lock, no handle, but somehow it stayed closed. The oppressive weight in the air lessened slightly, but not completely. Alex didn't wait to question it. He sprinted down the familiar halls, past mannequins frozen in grotesque poses under flickering lights, their plastic faces twisted by shadow into expressions they were never designed to have. When he finally stumbled into the security office, slamming the door and jamming a chair under the handle, he collapsed into the chair behind the monitors. Sweat dripped from his forehead, his pulse thudding like a drum in his ears. But the screens didn't offer the comfort he hoped for. The mall's cameras were all active now, every feed displaying the same impossible image, the dark corridor with the rusted door, flickering with static, though he'd left it behind. And in every feed, the shapes stood motionless, closer to the lens each time the screen glitched. They weren't bound to that place. They were watching him now. Then, the power went out. Alex froze, the sudden silence ringing in his ears. His heart skipped a beat as the screens flickered and went dark. He sat motionless for a moment, unsure whether the darkness was a relief or a new nightmare. The hum of the mall, the very thing that had once been a constant, now felt distant, like it had retreated into the void behind him. His pulse thudded in his throat as he leaned forward, instinctively reaching for the flashlight he kept in the drawer. The beam of light cut through the room, but it did nothing to dispel the suffocating darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. The walls, once familiar and safe, now felt like they were closing in on him, shifting with an unnatural rhythm. He could feel something, or someone, moving just beyond his vision. His stomach twisted, and he dared not look back. The faint crackle of the radio broke the silence, slicing through the air like a knife. "Alex," it whispered, distorted and hollow. "Alex, you shouldn't be here." The voice was familiar but wrong, too distant, too layered, like it was speaking from miles away and directly in his ear at the same time. His grip tightened around the flashlight. He couldn't move. The words sank into his chest like stones. His breath came in shallow gasps as he struggled to steady his nerves. He wanted to scream, but the sound died in his throat. Suddenly, the floor beneath him seemed to shift. The chair he sat in trembled, then slid slightly across the tile, as though it were being dragged. He looked down, but there was nothing there. The feeling of something moving underfoot, the pressure of invisible forces pulling at him, was enough to make his skin crawl. A sound. A shuffle. Not behind him, but within the room itself. His head snapped up toward the door, which was still barricaded. The latch creaked, as if someone, or something, was testing it from the outside. It rattled softly, a ghostly caress on the other side of the door. Then, a whisper. Louder this time. "Come out, Alex. You have nowhere left to run." His skin went cold. The door exploded open with a violent crash, the chair sliding back as if it were nothing but a toy. The hallway outside was darker than it had ever been, a depth of black that felt endless. For a split second, Alex thought he saw something, someone moving in the shadows, a glimpse of a face that shouldn't have been there. His throat tightened, his heart hammering against his ribs as he leaped to his feet. Then he heard it, footsteps. Not his own. Not any natural footsteps. These were heavier, deliberate, like something massive was walking toward him, slow and unbothered by the stillness. The ground trembled underfoot with each step. It was close. Too close. Alex dashed toward the back door of the security office, pulling it open. He needed to get out, to get away, but the hallway before him seemed to stretch forever, impossibly long, as though the very space itself had been bent and twisted by the thing in the shadows. He sprinted down the hall, his feet slipping on the polished floor as he ran. The air felt thick, pushing back against him as if it were alive. The walls seemed to pulse, the stains on them darkening and crawling like veins. His flashlight flickered wildly in his hand, casting chaotic streaks of light that distorted the world around him. He didn't dare look behind him. He could feel it, the thing, following him, just out of sight. A faint hiss, almost like a whisper, but louder this time, vibrating through the very walls of the mall. "You're not going anywhere, Alex." The darkness swallowed him whole, and for a moment, he thought it might be the end. The light from his flashlight blinked out once again, and he was plunged into pitch-black oblivion. Then, just when he thought he couldn't take another step, a dim, flickering light appeared ahead. The familiar glow of the security office. No. It was all wrong. It couldn't be the security office. It was too close. It was. And then, he saw it. The door to the office stood open, but not like it should have been. The floor inside was covered with a thick layer of dust, untouched by the chaos outside. The monitors were still running, but the screens were filled with static. Except for one. The screen with his face on it. It was a reflection, but not his own. A twisted, warped version of Alex stared back at him, grinning with eyes that were wide and empty. And then it spoke, its voice a guttural, echoing mockery of his own. "You're still here, Alex," it rasped. "You've always been here." The lights above him blinked once, twice, and then the mall's true darkness consumed everything. The world spun around him, the lights flickering out as though the mall itself was breathing in and out, exhaling the last remnants of its former reality. Alex stumbled backward, his legs weak, every fiber of his being screaming for him to run, to escape, but the mall's corridors no longer offered freedom. They were now a maze, an endless loop that wrapped around him like the grip of something old and cruel, pulling him deeper into its heart. He spun in place, the security office now a distant memory, swallowed by the thick, suffocating shadows. He could still hear the sound of his distorted voice echoing in his ears, the twisted laughter of the reflection on the screen. That thing, his thing, was still there, somewhere, in the blackness, staring at him with those wide, empty eyes. Alex's breath caught as he turned, forcing himself to move despite the weight of the air pressing down on him. Every step felt wrong, like the floor wasn't beneath him, but hovering just above his feet. It felt like he was walking on something that wasn't solid, more like the edge of a cliff that he couldn't see. Another whisper, colder than the last, grazed his skin. "It's too late to leave now, Alex." His head whipped around, eyes wide in search of the source. It was impossible. It shouldn't be possible, but there, just ahead, the shadows had coalesced into a shape, a figure. Tall, almost unnaturally so, its limbs thin and elongated, its body a dark silhouette against the faint, dying glow of the hallway lights. Alex froze. It was him. But not him. Not the man he saw every morning in the mirror, not the tired security guard who had been drinking his shitty coffee while waiting for the night to pass. This figure had the same face, but it was pale, ashen, and its mouth was twisted in a grin that shouldn't have been possible. His own smile. But wrong. So wrong. "You never leave," it whispered, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves in the wind. Alex took a step back, then another, the space between them narrowing with every breath he took. The thing moved toward him, slow, but inevitable. There was no escaping it. Its presence wasn't just in front of him, it was in his head, filling every corner of his mind with dread. Its empty eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, Alex felt the overwhelming urge to scream, to call out for help, but the sound never came. The figure's head tilted, its smile stretching wider as though it could swallow the entire world. "You've always been a part of us, Alex. You've always been here." With that, the figure reached forward, its hand long and bony, its fingers reaching for him with a pace that should have been too slow to be threatening, but somehow, it wasn't. The darkness seemed to thicken, pulling everything around him into a void, where time no longer mattered, where space bent and twisted like an animal in pain. Alex backed up against the wall, his heart slamming against his ribs, his body paralyzed by the weight of the air, the weight of his thoughts, the realization that this was it, this was what the mall had always been. It had been waiting for him. Watching him. From the moment he stepped into that security office, from the first time he walked those cursed halls. The whispering voices rose again, louder now, an unholy chorus of dissonance that filled his ears, drowning out everything else. They weren't just in the walls. They were inside his head. They were all around him. Inside of him. Alex squeezed his eyes shut, refusing to see the figure that had taken his face, refusing to acknowledge the inevitable. But then, nothing. The silence was deafening. He opened his eyes. The hallway was gone. The figure was gone. He was back in the security office. Alone. But the lights flickered, the screens hummed to life, and the radio crackled once more. His name. Again. Alex. The whisper was almost gentle now, like a soft lullaby. His heart skipped a beat. The door to the office stood ajar, just a crack, as if inviting him to step into the darkness once more. The hallway was no longer a maze, it was waiting. And he knew, deep down, that it would never let him leave. The last thing Alex saw, as he hesitated at the doorway, was the reflection in the monitor. His face, pale and twisted, staring back at him with those same empty eyes. And then the screen went dark.